I'll never forget the moment I realized Amina was gone. It wasn't just that she disappeared, no, it was the way the city seemed to swallow her up whole, as though she had never existed at all. One minute, she was a bright, innocent girl with a future ahead of her, and the next, she was a shadow, consumed by the same darkness she had tried to escape. I first met Amina when she was just a little girl, living with her parents in a small apartment in our city. She was the kind of child who could light up the room with her smile. Even though her family wasn't wealthy, they had something rare: happiness. Her father, Tond, worked as a mechanic at a local garage, while her mother, Kemi, taught at a nearby school. They were a simple family, but they had big hearts. Amina was their pride and joy. She was always running around, playing with the other kids in the neighborhood, always laughing, always full of life. People in the building knew her by name, and there wasn't a single person who didn't smile when they saw her. But that all changed one night. It was late when the news hit us. Amina's parents had been in a car accident on the way home from visiting family. A truck had lost control, and it crashed right into their car. Tond and Kemi didn't survive. The truck driver was fine, but Amina's world, her entire world, shattered in an instant. She was just 10 years old. At first, she stayed with her aunt in a different part of the city, but it wasn't long before we all realized that she was being neglected. Her aunt couldn't care for her the way she needed. So Amina came back to our apartment building, where she had grown up. No one knew exactly what to do. We couldn't just let her be, but no one knew how to help her through the pain she was feeling. I was one of the first to try to take care of her. I lived on the same floor, so I saw her often. I gave her food, I helped with her homework, and I tried my best to keep her company. But something in her had changed. She wasn't the same cheerful girl who used to run around with the other children. She was quiet, distant. She would sit by herself for hours, staring at nothing. I remember one evening, a few weeks after the accident, when I found her sitting on the rooftop, looking out at the city. She didn't even notice me until I spoke. "Amina," I said softly, walking over to her. "What are you doing up here alone?" She didn't look at me right away. When she finally did, her eyes were hollow, as though all the life had drained out of them. She shrugged, but didn't speak. From that day on, she seemed more withdrawn, more isolated. I would see her wandering the streets, her head down, not really seeing anything around her. It was as though she was trapped inside her own mind, locked in a prison of grief that she couldn't escape. And then one day, I found her with something in her hands. I was walking down the street when I saw her standing by an alleyway, clutching something in her palm. Her eyes were glazed over, and her fingers were shaking. I approached cautiously, not wanting to startle her. "Amina," I called out softly. "What's in your hand?" She looked up at me slowly, her face almost blank. "It's nothing," she said, but her voice was shaky. I could tell she was lying. I took a step closer and gently pulled her hand open. Inside, I found a small bag of white powder. My stomach dropped. I knew what it was right away. Drugs. I couldn't believe it. Amina, the sweet little girl I had watched grow up, was holding drugs in her hands. "Amina, where did you get this?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Her eyes darted to the ground, and she didn't answer. I could see tears forming in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. "I met someone," she whispered. "He said it would help me forget the pain. He said it would make me feel better." The man she was talking about was a stranger. He had lured her in with promises of comfort, of relief from the overwhelming grief she was carrying. She didn't know what she was getting into. She was just a child who had lost everything. I tried to talk to her, to explain how dangerous this was, but she wouldn't listen. The drugs had already started to take hold. They gave her temporary relief from the pain, a brief escape from the loss of her parents. But it wasn't real. The drugs only made things worse. It was a vicious cycle, and Amina was falling deeper into it every day. I talked to some of the adults in the building, tried to get them to understand what was happening. But the truth was, no one knew how to help her. Drugs weren't something we had dealt with in our neighborhood before. We were all just trying to survive, and no one knew what to do when a child started slipping away like that. As the months went by, Amina became more and more unrecognizable. She stopped going to school. She stopped talking to anyone. She would disappear for hours at a time, only to come back looking more and more like a ghost. Her face was gaunt, her eyes bloodshot, her body trembling from the withdrawals. I saw her one evening, stumbling down the street, barely able to walk. Her hands were shaking violently, and her clothes were torn. When I tried to help her, she pushed me away, her eyes wild with fear. "I need more," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I need more to make it stop." I tried to talk to her, to make her see that this wasn't the way to cope, but the words wouldn't reach her anymore. She had lost herself to the drugs, and there was nothing I could do to bring her back. One night, I woke up to the sound of her crying. I rushed outside, calling her name, but she wasn't in the building. I ran down the stairs and into the street, my heart pounding in my chest. That's when I saw her, standing in the middle of the road, looking up at the dark sky. Her eyes were glazed over, and she looked completely lost. "Amina, please," I begged, running toward her. "Come back inside. You don't have to do this." But she didn't listen. She just stood there, her arms outstretched as though waiting for something. I tried to pull her away, but she fought me, her strength fueled by the desperation inside her. In the end, I couldn't save her. Amina vanished that night, just like the darkness had swallowed her whole. We searched the city, asked around, but she was gone. No one ever saw her again. I still think about her every day. Sometimes, I wonder if she's still out there, lost somewhere in the city, still chasing the darkness that took her away. I'll never know what happened to her. All I have are the memories of a little girl who was once full of life, who slipped away from the world and into something darker than any of us could have imagined. And I'll never forget the sound of her voice, the last time I heard it, whispering, asking for help, but no one was there to listen.